so rare.
They have been rare. The last news that I wanted to bring forward that we already discussed yesterday, but I think it requires further exploration, is the Brazilian election. So Lula won, and yesterday we discussed a lot about the shortcomings of Lula, but also obviously the fact that we're very happy that Lula is winning as one compared to Bolsonaro, and how we hope that Brazil will come back in full force in the fight of climate change, for rights, and support the international community on these topics. But I want to discuss about the fact that Bolsonaro did not concede yet. So a bit like Trump did in the United States, Bolsonaro lost the election for a small margin, and so far he did not contest the election but did not concede. So his silence is actually very heavy, because that means that in the last few hours, for example, his supporters started to block highways, started to conduct rallies against the result of the election. And I think that this is something that we need to realize, is that whenever there is not a just transition of power, so even if Lula tomorrow become, the transition is going to be on the 1st of January. So even when Lula is fully recognized as president of Brazil, the fact that a massive amount of the population, they recognize themselves in a leader, and this leader did not concede, is going to cause a lot of social and political problems to Brazil. And this is something that we saw in the United States, we see now in Brazil, and I fear that these are just examples for many more far-righters. It's like a playbook for far-righters on how to behave when they lose elections. It might happen to Erdogan this summer, it might happen sooner or later to, someone like what's the name of the Hungarian Prime Minister? Orban. So it might happen to many others at a certain point to lose, if they still respect the democratic rule. And then they unleash this playbook, they create instability and further deteriorate democracy. And this is a global problem, because as we see, it happens in a country, it happens somewhere else. We have a global media. Many of us now speak English, Spanish, or other languages that are very spread, and so it's easy to find this news. And these are all things that pile up on the fact that democracy is not doing very well, and we are not finding very good ways to solve it.
Yeah, and I think to bounce back on yesterday's conversation, we actually had a long discussion on Twitch with some people that were commenting about the military's threats of taking over, and how do you ensure that military governments, so that outgoing wannabe dictators don't actually use the military to take over, how do you go from there, and so on. We talked more widely about the issue with a lot of political systems right now, and about potential fixes, and about how by being global, by working together across borders, we can learn from one another, we can actually work together, and so on. And for example, one of the suggestions I gave was to only have one-term mandates. So if you stay 7 years in power, 5 years in power, and then you can't run again, it's clear from the very beginning that you can't run again. So you can't use that, refusing to concede at the end of it, because it's clear. Then, of course, you have dictators that just stay even though, past their term, kind of like Xi Jinping just did in China by adding a new term to the constitution. But I think that's already one. And I think then there's a lot of issues with the current political system, whereby it's how we used to it, but I find it very problematic that we elect mostly one man, or sometimes rarely someone from another gender, to lead an entire country, instead of actually working more collaboratively. So for example, if you were to look at the Swiss model, where they have a federal, I'm probably not using the right word, but a federal council with 7 people leading the countries and taking turns. Yeah. You diminish drastically the risk of actually being able to have a military taking over, or someone like Bolsonaro not conceding. If you had systems where collaboration and joint leadership, like in Switzerland, were more prominent, it would be very different. And then to finish my tirade, so one-term mandate, more collaboration, less lonely leadership. But I think also then actually reworking political systems from the local to the global level, so that it's not around a few individuals. Look, you need executive leadership in crisis. I'm not saying you don't. Yeah. What I'm saying is we need citizens to be much more involved in general, not by a yearly citizens' assemblies where you ask for your opinion, but for example, for participatory budgeting, participatory legislation, so where citizens participate in the creation, can initiate legislations and so on. By having maybe a fourth branch of government that is created by sortition. I don't know. I haven't actually explored those ideas the budgeting and so on, yes, not sortition. There are experts on this. But I think it's interesting to look at different types of governments to hold those in power accountable, to make sure it doesn't become an oligarchy, and to actually avoid this type of situation.
Yeah, so I fully agree. And the governance type, how to govern a country or a region better, or the globe, is going to be a big focus of our work in the next few months. But I think it keeps on coming up, because obviously democracy is not doing well even when it's very strong. So we need to find better system to govern ourselves. I see a very interesting comment from Omis Coffee that says, I'm quite worried about how the federal presidents of every region are going to try to paralyze a progressive government of Lula. And also he doesn't have majority in the parliament. I fully agree. So there are two very important issues here. One is institutional activism or blockade. So other cities or regions can try to prevent the federal system of Brazil, or the federal level of Brazil, from passing progressive policies or from being effective in its progressive actions. So for example, even if Lula wants to save the Amazon, if the governor of part of the Amazon region really try not to make this possible, it's going to be very tough. And I think this is a big issue. I think this is also democracy. So in one way, we need to respect where the competencies are. I just hope that common sense, at least on big topics, can prevail, or that changes of government at the other levels can follow.
And I don't know if it's relevant, but this morning I was listening to the BBC podcast about this, and they were interviewing politicians from Lula's party, and saying that in Brazil, it's often the case, because it's a proportional system, that the parliament is so fragmented, and it's so deeply fragmented, that you actually need to make very broad coalitions with something like 9 parties in order to stand a chance. And they made a joke that, if Jesus was trying to create a government in Brazil right now, he would have to work with so many other religions in order to do so.
Which was a very good,
I thought it was a good way of showing it. Yeah. But I also think it's problematic when it results in blockage of legislation. But trying to go beyond one's party is actually a very healthy thing, right? For me, I'm never more worried than when I see an entire parliament and an entire government from the same party. And for example, in my country, France, after the first election of Macron, it was the case that he had so many seats and so on. And it's really worrying, because then you have no accountability, you have no counterbalance, etc. Even if it's more or less on your side of the political spectrum.
Yeah.
So again, it shouldn't lead to blockage. I think we should try to lead by consensus much more in general. But I don't necessarily think it's bad to have to build coalitions if they can be stable. And for coalitions to be able to be stable, I think you need to have longer term visions than is often the case in politics. And for this, you need to involve citizens to create those visions.
And I think a cultural shift is also needed. If you think about it, in Germany, coalitions actually hold on for every time for the full mandate of a government. And I'm so impressed. I'm Italian, and
how many governments did you have?
17 years, something like that. So I think that the cultural shift is super important. And it's something that often is overlooked and we don't really think about.
Completely agree. By the way, I sent the link of what Andrea mentioned in the chat. I'm trying to change... Let me try again. I'm trying to send the sources.